You're listening to episode 107 of Literacy in Color. What happens after students master single-syllable words, but then the words they're expected to read keep getting longer and more complex? Today, we're going beyond basic phonics with Dr. Devin Kearns to talk all about polysyllabic word reading. We're digging into why single-letter vowels may actually be some of the trickiest graphemes our students encounter, what the research says about traditional syllable division rules, and how strategies like ESHALOV or tapping into vowel flexibility, morphology, and lexical verification can help students tackle longer words. We also get really practical about what this instruction could look like in upper elementary classrooms and how much of it students actually need. So if you've ever had a student who can beautifully decode a one-syllable word, but completely falls apart when they encounter a word like fantastic or photosynthesis, this episode is exactly what you need. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Devin Kearns today, who I had the privilege of hearing speak at this past summer's New York Reading League Summer Symposium. I really enjoyed his talk about polysyllabic decoding. And I definitely nerded out about your distinction between using polysyllabic versus multisyllabic. I appreciate that. But maybe you can take some time to introduce yourself, the work that you do, the research that you do, and what you're passionate about in this whole literacy space.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Devin Kearns. I'm a professor of early literacy at North Carolina State University. My background is I started off as a third grade teacher, and I worked in a school district in the Los Angeles area and had a lot of kids who were poor readers. And for my first couple of years teaching, I didn't do a good job of teaching them because I didn't know how to teach reading really well. And when I finally got training on good evidence-based practice in reading, it made me really upset that no one had taught me about these things before. And actually is what inspired me to do the job I do now. So I'm a teacher educator, and I do other kinds of research on all kinds of topics, but that's one of my real passions is teacher education, and that's why I decided to do that. So now what I do is a combination of research on technical things about how long words work and also about how do you help teachers implement evidence-based practices. So that's kind of what I do. And yes, I say polysyllabic rather than multisyllabic because when you talk about words that have more than one morpheme, the term is polymorphemic because there's more than one morpheme. And so polysyllabic fits with that. In addition, syllable is a word of Greek origin, and poly is an affix that often goes with words of Greek origin. So that's why I decided to start doing poly rather than multi. But I always tell people, I truly do not care. You can say multi to me all day long, and I am perfectly happy for that to be the case. So I'm not a zealot about that. It made sense to me. I think I mentioned in that talk that at some point someone was like, I read all these papers and I was basically this existential crisis of which am I going to use? And so that's what I landed on.
Well, linguistically, it's, I think, the proper way to do it because you wouldn't mix a Latin affix with a Greek base and that kind of thing. So I'm like, oh, we got to get everyone on the bandwagon.
I think it is possible that one of my enduring contributions, I don't know if you can even call it a contribution, would be to at least have some people say polysyllabic, so I hear it more than I used to. Again, it's all about the practices, not so much the terminology.
100%. And I know you're big on that too. So Today, I'd love to get into some big word territory and how we exactly tackle them. And a lot of times, especially now, a lot of K2 educators are implementing structured literacy practices, foundational skill work, and kids are really getting great phonics instruction. But what happens when the students get older, when the texts get harder and more complex? What kind of cognitive shift is happening for the reader? And maybe with your researcher hat on too, you can speak to the prevalence of some of these polysyllabic words in the text that students are encountering later in the grades.
Yeah, yeah. Why don't I start with the second part? Because, it's about what they're actually going to read, right? So basically, after first grade, the vast majority of new words the kids learn have more than one syllable. So I think it's after first grade, like 50% of the words in second grade have more than one syllable. And after that, it's almost all of them have more than one syllable because if you think about it, the way we expand our vocabulary is largely by learning new long words largely with affixes, right? So the other thing that happens with words as kids get older is we have an increasing number of derivational affixes, right? So words that have like shun on them or something like that. And so we get an increasing number of those. And so by the time kids hit middle school, they're seeing every year something like over 200,000 words with more than one syllable. And so the number expands quite a bit. And basically, after second grade, it's all about those words. And even in second grade, it's about those words. But it becomes almost all about those words once kids hit the upper grades. So, kind of your first part of your question about like, what are the needs? Well, that's the big thing is that once kids hit second and third grade, the words are going to be long, and many of them are going to have derivational affixes, and they're going to be able to have to read those words. And so basically having the ability to read those words quickly and easily is really important. And that's where knowledge of affixes is really critical because kids need to know that. In addition to knowing some strategies for decoding kind of the base word, they also need to understand like here are the affixes you might encounter and things like that. So that's one of the biggest foci for teaching kids to read words in the upper grades is focusing on affixes. I also want to emphasize that if you think about, everybody talks about the reading rope, right? And sort of like there's that increasingly automatic. When you think about kind of there's that curve thing, sort of it curves in. I think on the top side, it says increasingly strategic. And it says on the bottom side, it says increasingly automatic, right? As you kind of tighten the rope, the amount of time you need to spend on the decoding is declines because that rope is already pretty strong. But to get kids to really consolidate everything, having strategies to read the long words is really critical.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I like to think too, oftentimes we think about foundational skill work is really drilling into this single syllable territory where decodability is really reliable. And yet, once the text gets more complex, like we still need to equip them with some kind of strategies to be able to tackle those bigger words where you have vowel flexing and
Mhm.
pronunciation shifts. You have the schwa sound come into place. You have a lot of
Yeah.
morphemes that perhaps you haven't been exposed to yet. So, the foundational decoding skills, I think, grow with the students as they get older too.
100%. I just finished a study that's going to be in, I think, Frontiers in Psychology next couple of months. And what we did was to examine, like, does it matter how many syllables a word has after you count for the number of letters in terms of whether or not kids are able to read a word quickly and accurately? So the question is like, well, if a word has a lot of letters, obviously it's going to be harder, right? And if a word has a lot of syllables, it's going to be harder. But what if we kind of compete those things against each other, right? In theory, you could say like, well, if we know the word has a lot of letters, it doesn't matter how many syllables it has. It just matters it's a long word in terms of letters. We actually found the opposite, that really it's the number of syllables that drive the difficulty. So kids are much less likely to get words right if the words have more syllables than depending on the letters. So really, to your point, I mean, the words get more complex. They have features that short words just don't. Like, except for compound words, and you know this, you alluded to it, except for compound words, every word in English that has more than one syllable has a reduced vowel or a schwa sound. That's just how the language works, right? It's not true in all languages, it's true in English. And so that's a challenge kids are going to face literally every day, every moment they're reading, they're going to need to handle that. And it is not the same as what you do with one syllable words, right? There's also things with like, I think we talked about this in the presentation that I gave. If you think about like, if you take the letter I, right? How many different things can the letter I say, right? And there are at least 4 different things that the letter I can say in a word that's more than one syllable. And so that's less consistent than it is with one syllable words, as you pointed out. Right? With one syllable words, it is actually much more consistent, much more for some of those single letter vowels, I call them. It's much easier to predict what it's going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And we just talked about how in 2, 3, 4 syllable words, there can be these stumbling blocks because, as you said, English is a stress time language. We have,
So,
the stress reduction in these larger complex words. And vowels can be one of the things that really trip us up. And in your opinion or in your research, do you find a particular type of grapheme that's more challenging for students than others? Sometimes in primary lands, we're like, "Oh, those consonant digraphs are really tricky."
totally, totally. Yeah, exactly. In the polysyllabic space, it's all about the single letter vowels, right? So it's all about that I that's in minor and linen and rabbit and flexible and glorious. Like that I just gave you 5 different things that can say, right? So it's really those single letter vowels that present the most difficulty. And I've done some research on this where I've actually looked at more than 10,000 words in English that are in text for kids in grades K-5. And I found that the pronunciation of the single letter vowels, it's not easy to predict, particularly when you have that pattern where you have a vowel, a single consonant letter, and then another vowel. Identifying the pronunciation of that first vowel is really hard. So, for example, like the I in tiger, identifying the likely pronunciation of that I in tiger is much more challenging than it is if it has an EA. Yes, EA says S sometimes. It's much more likely to be E anyway. And things like AI and OA, like those are really consistent. Like you can count on those things to be that way. Also, in English, as words get longer, we tend to use more of those single letter vowels, right? So, you have this compounding issue where the things that are more consistent that you learn because those are the less frequent things like the EA, the digraphs, and so on. Now you get to 2 syllable words, and you've got this whole other thing where we're using those single letter vowels to represent so many possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another reason why morphology can be such a high leverage tool for our older learners. Because when we explore the derivatives of a word, we then have maybe some word relatives to tap into to help with the spelling or
Totally.
pronunciation of some of those words. Like a word like president. Okay, I have a schwa in the middle. But if I compare it to preside, I'm like, oh, yeah, there's an I in there. And having those kinds of connections can be really powerful when we're thinking about spelling in particular.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I love hearing you talk about syllable division. So maybe you can share your thoughts on syllable division
Uh,
strategies and the language that we really should be intentional with using when we're helping students tackle those larger words.
Yes. So this is another thing that may be a contribution, or it might be something that people just hate. But I think I've actually helped shift the conversation about this a little bit. So syllable division for the less initiated, most educators know at this point. But what it's about is when you have particularly a word with 2 or more syllables, how do you divide it so that you can predict the pronunciation of the vowels in it, right? So there are 2 really common patterns. There's the VCCV, where you have a vowel, 2 consonants, other vowel. So like rabbit is a good example of that. And then the VCV, where you have a vowel, a consonant, a vowel, like in tiger, right? So those are the 2 most common pronunciation patterns. And what people have tried to do is to help students figure out the pronunciation of those by giving them these rules, right? That basically tell you how to divide the word and then how to pronounce the vowel, right? So with the VCCV pattern, like in rabbit, the rule is to divide it between the consonants. And the second part of it then is to know basically what the pronunciation of that first vowel is, depending on whether it's followed by a consonant. The idea is that I'm just going to, a little primer for people who are less initiated, but when a vowel is in the middle or the beginning of a syllable, it typically says the short sound, and sometimes people call that a closed syllable. When the vowel is at the end of a syllable, it says the long sound, and it's often called an open syllable. And so what, the patterns that people get taught are that when you divide the VCCV word, like rabbit, divided between the consonants. The first syllable, R-A-B, says rab because the A is in the middle, right? Where with tiger, with the VCV, the pattern is you divide it after the first vowel, and that, because the vowel's at the end, says the long sound. So that's why it says tiger, right? So those are the patterns, right? So in theory, this is really great and really helpful. And when I started to learn about the science of reading, I was amazed because I just didn't realize there's any consistency to this. I just kind of thought, it's all made up, right? And so I was really excited to be able to give students a tool that they could use where, oh my gosh, like you can predict the pronunciation of this in this way. And so I taught that for a long time, taught to students, I taught to teachers, but there was always kind of this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like, how good is this really? And that's where I did that study. And I showed that if you look at a lot of words, it's really unpredictable. So with the letter E in a VCV word, it's just as likely to be a long sound as a short sound. And the most common thing it's going to be is a schwa. Okay. So half the time it's a schwa. And then between the other two, it's about 50-50. Right. So, if you're trying to teach kids a division rule that involves an E, it's really not helpful to have that vowel, consonant, vowel, first vowel says the long sound rule because it's just not reliable enough. Right. Based on that I just realized that teaching these kind of specific patterns in this way wasn't necessarily the best thing to do because there are actually more efficient options. So it's not just like don't do anything. I'm a very strong believer in explicit systematic phonics instruction to give kids tools. I just realized, that might not be the tool that kids need. We can give them something potentially different that does that. And it all came from kind of that feeling I had that, maybe this is not quite as good as I thought it was. That's one of the things I've always tried to do in my research is I try to be like an honest broker about the data. Like, do the data support this? Sometimes you have these moments where you're like, I really wish the data did support this, but they don't. And that's where you have to be a real scientist and be like, okay, go where the data go. And so I really thought syllables were going to be the whole thing. And I also thought when I started doing research on decoding, I thought it was all going to be about letter sounds. And I did a study where I did morphemes and letter sounds. I was convinced letter sound knowledge was where all the power was. Totally wrong. It was really about the affixes, and that made the big difference for kids. So anyway, so I think that was what I did as I realized, even though this is really popular and I've done it, and it seems like a good idea, that the strength of the pattern is not that great. And to add to that, it's also really hard for kids to learn because we give them this additional information. It's extra stuff. It's kind of cognitive overhead, right? And the question is whether or not they need all of that in order to be successful. And one of the things we talk about these days, like giving kids strategies just to use context clues, bad idea, right? For reading words, totally true. But, you could argue that syllable division is just as bad as that in terms of the inefficiency in terms of time, right? And so it's always about like, what is the benefit of this? And I think what I've concluded is syllable division doesn't have as much value as we wish it did. It doesn't work. It's okay for us as teachers, as kids, because we have other things we can do.
And I mean, I've used all the things as well, like rabbit, camels, tigers, oh my, like. But when we think about even like an Orton Gillingham approach, where anecdotally, a lot of people will say, this has been a game changer for my students. I think we also have to take into consideration the tightly controlled word list where everything is going to magically follow the pattern that you're teaching them, where they're practicing that, versus reading in the wild where the pattern might not always be as reliable too, and different perspectives to take into consideration.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, words in the wild, like you can't predict, right? I just an aside about that is this is where people sometimes say like, well, what do you do if it's a word you've never seen before? Right. So then like, don't you need a rule? And my feeling is like, you do need something, but like you're going to guess what it is anyway, right? I mean, and the thing about that is that if you don't know a rule, for example, ZEBRA, right? So you sound that out, you've never heard of this thing before, right? Then you're going to sound that out. If you live here in the US and you've learned syllable, you'd say zebra, right? If you've never heard it before. And why? Because you've learned, this pattern, right? But it turns out the way we say it is zebra, of course. People say like, well, see, you need that rule, I say in that case, like, well, the rule doesn't send you in the right direction anyway. But it's also like what you need to do is come up with a plausible pronunciation that's based on the letters. And as long as that works for you in your brain and you have represented everything, because some kids like aren't putting all the sounds in there, even when they're reading to themselves, and that's because they're poor readers typically. But if they're getting all the sounds in their brain and they just don't say it the right way, it actually doesn't matter until they embarrass themselves when they say it out loud. Usually like in middle school or like high school where everyone's like, that is not what that word is. I always give the example of my uncle talked about he had heard of Yosemite National Park and had read about Yosemite National Park, right? So I used to say, like, in the end, it doesn't matter if it's in your brain in one way. Hermione, Hermione, which is probably what most of us said.
Worry, awry.
Yeah, exactly. So, we all kind of have these examples of things where we came up with our own internal pronunciation because we didn't have an external reference. We only read about it. And that works okay until you say it out loud. Then you need a reference. But I make that point because we always add new words to our vocabulary. And if we don't have the word in our vocabulary already, we're going to have to add it. And we're going to have to add it. We're going to use some strategy for adding it. And it may be that what we decide to do isn't reflective of the VCV rule or whatever. But as in zebra, like, it isn't necessarily what you thought anyway. And as an aside, in South Africa, they say zebra. So that's just another fun fact.
Yeah, Peppa Pig too. I'm in my toddler mom era, and I have my children speaking with accents sometimes.
Awesome. I love
Garage.
it. Yeah, right.
Does forming your skill-based groups feel a little mysterious? You have the screening data, but you're still asking, okay, how do I use this to move students forward? A good friend of the podcast, Dr. Stephanie Stoller, runs the Reading Science Academy, and she created an exclusive grouping resource bundle free for Literacy in Color listeners. You'll get Stephanie's cheat sheets for grouping students at the beginning, middle, and end of the year, plus a video that walks you through a real classroom example. I'll always proclaim that I myself am a proud Reading Science Academy member for life, and I can genuinely say that the quality of the resources and professional learning is top-notch. The Facebook community is also one of the most supportive spaces I've experienced. Reading Science Academy is honestly one of the first places I go whenever I have a question about literacy instruction or assessment. So go to readingscienceacademy.com/color to get your free grouping resource bundle today. So what kind of language should we use with students when it comes to tackling words if the patterns aren't always reliable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I do actually think that it's helpful for students to learn about when vowels are in a certain position in a word, they say a certain thing, right? So a vowel at the end saying the long sound, a vowel at the beginning or middle saying the short sound is convenient if you're going to break words into parts. I'm not talking about necessarily breaking them using a rule. We're going to talk about that, using those syllable division rules we talked about. But it's still helpful to know that because it gives you a way to think about the pronunciations when you see them. So if I show you, H-I, you know that says hi, right? If I show you L-I, you know that says lie, right? If you have this knowledge, vowels at the end, say the long sound, vowels in the middle, beginning, say the short sound, that is a powerful piece of information that you can use when you are reading. So I always teach kids about that. Now, this is where the terminology question comes in because often people will call those open and closed syllables. I mentioned that before. I don't use the terms open and closed syllables, right? The reason is that I ask people is like, why do kids need to know that? Like, and for, your listeners, like, think about it for a second. Like, why do kids need to know it's an open or closed? I mean, and then the second question is like, why are they even called open and closed? And some people know, right? I mean, I'm sure you know because you are a word nerd. But there's a linguistic reason for it that has to do with the pronunciation of tense and lax, vowels and so on. But like nobody knows about what that is, right? And so when we give kids this open and closed, we're adding, again, I mentioned the cognitive overhead, right? We're giving them this extra stuff to remember that's not necessary, right? Sort of like I'll refer to it as meta knowledge. It's knowledge about knowledge. It's something like you don't need to know open and close because really what you want to do is to get kids to say the right sound. If we add on the information, it's knowledge about the knowledge we really want the kids to know we can cut that out. And so what I call them is I call them long vowel syllables and short vowel syllables, because vowels at the end says the long sound, that's a long vowel syllable. Vowel beginning middle says the short sound, it's called a short vowel syllable, right? Do you have to do it that way? Absolutely not. I have just found that that is a convenient shorthand, and that kids really respond well to that. That when you teach them that pattern, it works really well. And what we often do in studies that I've done, and this is based on studies that were done like years ago, you can just have kids read cards that have syllables on them. And, there's you can find a list of syllables on my website, the teacher materials page. Have kids practice reading syllables and do it quickly, right? And we found that that alone is really effective. In one study I did, we found that kids were slightly faster after 6 lessons, slightly faster at pronouncing words correctly that had that first syllable. They could pronounce, like, if the word was tiger, they were more likely to say tiger quickly, in addition to accurately, than they were if they learned the division rule. The division rule, it did help them become accurate, but they weren't as fast, because the practice that I described is really good at getting kids to be fast. And we get rid of the open and closed knowledge. All we need to know is their long and short vowel syllables. It cuts out some of the extra overhead.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I love how you talked about this knowledge about knowledge, because oftentimes teachers, they're getting their science of reading enthusiasm. They're so excited to be
Right.
learning this. Like, English finally makes sense, and you want to impart the wisdom. But at
Yep.
the end of the day, what's the baseline information that we need to move the needle to get students reading and writing proficiently?
I love that point. I think that's so critical. And it's valuable for us as educators to know the technical things, right? We should understand the language that we teach, but what we know is not the same thing as what the kids need to know. And I think that's important. Like, kids don't need to know what a trigraph is, right? Kids don't need to know the distinction between what a diphthong is. They can know that owl has kind of a moving part, but you don't need to know the term for that, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. And so maybe we can get into some specific strategies that are used for decoding bigger words. And one is ESHALOV or ESHALOV, potato, potato.
Yeah, so depends how you decide to break it up, right?
Yeah. So maybe
Yeah,
you can walk us through that
sure.
acronym
Yeah,
and where the basic premise for that came from.
yeah, definitely. So ESHALOV stands for every syllable has at least one vowel. And it comes from research by Rolando Connor, who developed a program for teaching kids with reading difficulty in the middle elementary grades. And this idea of ESHALOV was that when you're trying to break a word into parts to read it, the first thing you can do that's convenient is to sort of say, okay, I need to break this word up so that every syllable has a vowel letter, or, it could be a digraph kind of thing, a pair of vowel letters. And so when I'm doing a strategy for practicing it, so when you're learning it, you do a little more marking. Once eventually we want you to just do it without that. But I'm teaching it, I'll teach the kids to mark the vowel. So you can put a dot under let's say the word is, we'll say fantastic, just for fun. Okay, so fantastic, you have 3 vowels and you can dot them, right? The A, and the I. Okay, and so now we have every syllable has at least one vowel. So then we break the word into parts. We break it up so that every syllable has a vowel. So typically people break it after the N, fan, and after the S, task, tick, right? And so that works great because basically every syllable has at least one vowel. Okay. Now, it's also possible to break that up fant, ast, and ick, right? And even though it'll be fantastic, like it sounds maybe slightly more awkward than fantastic, it's still totally fine because we always have to make these adjustments anyway, right? We have this thing we have to do because every word that's more than one syllable has a schwa sound in it. You're always going to have to do some tuning of these things. And so it's okay to do it that way. And this is where we get away from the rule. So as long as every syllable has at least one vowel, and every syllable kind of looks okay. That's the other part of this I talk about is like, if you can't do FA and then NTAS because no word in English starts with NT, right? So it has to kind of look like something that you would see in a real word. So as long as it's that case, then you break it up. Fant is okay because the syllable has one vowel in it. So that's a really key idea, is that it gets away from the need to do the kind of like division rule. If we have this ability to sort of say, like, okay, we can just break it up this way that I've got the syllable one vowel. It's fine. And then the second piece of this is it goes back to the short and long vowel syllables. So now I say, oh, F-A-N, short vowel syllable, vowels in the middle, says the short sound, fan. Same thing for F-A-N-T, F-A-N-T, right? Still, vowel in the middle says the short sound, so now it's fant. But either way, it works fine, right? So that's where I try to give teachers something that's easy to use that kids will get. And I can tell you, anecdotally, when I talk to teachers about this and they come back and they tell me the kids finally get it, or whatever, they just they love it. So exciting, I think we may have talked about that a little bit. It just makes things a little bit simpler for kids. You just teach the two things are, you need to know vowels at the end, say the long sound, vowels at the beginning or middle, say the short sound, we'll call those short and long vowel syllables. And the second thing is we need to know every syllable has at least one vowel. We break the word into parts, so every syllable has at least one vowel. And then we can pronounce each part and put it back together. So that is a really powerful and simple tool that I describe to people as an alternative to using syllable division. But it's worth saying, some people, they'll say well, syllable division really works for my kids. What I say is, I don't doubt that that's true, because I imagine you're a very good teacher and that the kids worked really hard and learned this and that it is helping them. The message I always send is it possible that if you did this other thing, it will work just as well or even better? And so I always put that in people's heads. I'm not telling you to shift everything this week, but depending on when in the year you're listening to this podcast, if it's still early in the year and you haven't started all your groups, or, it's the first couple of weeks, you haven't gotten along words yet, think about trying that, right? Maybe that's a good option. And you can find lots of videos online about how to do this. There are videos of me kind of explaining this too, and you can listen to the podcast as well. So there are ways to do this that you can find online. It's not really hard to figure out. So this is just something, give it a thought. And it will fit right into your existing lessons, right? Where you would be teaching syllable division, and if that's part of the expectation for a given program. You can do this instead of that, but it's still focusing on the pronunciations of those syllables. We're still talking about using a pattern. It's not just guess at it.
Yeah, that's the number one thing in my back pocket always. I've always found great success with it as well. And I think you're so right in talking about lots of things can work, but sometimes fine-tuning your craft is finding what's going to be most efficient too. So it's okay to try something new.
I love that point. Yeah.
Maybe you can talk to the research around syllabification versus a kind of morphemic analysis and what's out there, because I know those are two different lenses to tackle some words. And hey, sometimes you have words that don't have multiple morphemes.
That's right. Yeah. Research suggests that when words have morphemes, teaching kids about the morphemes is really powerful. So there's a strategy called peeling off that is from a program designed by Maureen Lovett, who's a researcher in Toronto, and she developed a program where they built that strategy. And basically, you can kind of put it together with the ESHALOV strategy, where you teach kids a list of affixes, and there's a list on my website, for prefixes and suffixes, and there are lots of other. My list is not any better than anybody else's. You can find any list online, but I just have it for convenience. So you have a list of affixes, and then you can circle the affixes that you see in the word, read those affixes. You'll end up with a base word, right? And that base word sometimes itself needs to be divided using your ESHALOV strategy. And then you put the whole thing back together. And when you do that, the kids can read it. So basically, that is the base strategy. Peeling off has a strong evidence base for kids who have a need for practice that way. And in general, researchers have found that teaching kids about morphemes for reading words aloud and spelling them too is helpful. So it is important and valuable for kids to learn about morphemes in words versus just learning about the syllables. There is a lot of unknown information about the extent to which you need to teach kids all the details about morphemes and so on. So some programs are really extensively focused on getting all the different iterations of the words and creating these matrices for the words and more morpheme. Those things aren't bad, but the data are sort of out on those. One of the programs that was designed to do this doesn't have a strong evidence base. It's popular, but doesn't have a strong evidence base. And so we still don't know entirely what's the right way to balance the focus on how to incorporate meaning and how to teach kids to be flexible, because sometimes people will turn it into kind of like a wordplay game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the data are not as strong. And so we're still, I think, learning a lot about that. So teaching kids obviously about the meanings of morphemes and how they link to words is valuable and important. But the degree to which you do that, we don't really know this juncture, like the best amount of time to spend on that.
Yeah, and I'm a huge morphology girl. And I think too, sometimes we fall into the trap of having to break words into the smallest parts all of the time, where sometimes you'll have still a base with a prefix, and that's enough to get students reading and understanding.
Okay.
Like a word like information. Technically, you can break it down into the FORM, like as a Latin base, but in form, I can get away with that. And
Yeah,
so we also have to be not so rigid with how much we have to analyze all
that's
of
right.
the time in every scenario and keeping the bullseye in mind. What's the end goal?
Yeah, no, it's totally right. And I mean, morphology, it's complicated too, right? You tell me like archer, right? Like, why is it called an archer? Well, it's because they used to stand in an arch when they would shoot the arrows, right? Why is it called a henchman? I don't actually know that one, but like it has some morphological base, right? Man is something, I mean, hench does sound like a bad thing. So I guess I'm sure it means something somewhere in history, but we don't know now. And then, like strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, blackberry, gooseberry, like, what is the deal with all that, right? So the morphology is not always easy. Even a word like understand, it doesn't mean to stand under, right? And the base for that is really kind of complex. So there is this question about what's the right level of analysis to do. And I think that's where, as a field, we haven't quite calibrated yet about what's the right level of analysis. As kids are like, let's say in fourth grade, and we want them to learn about this. Do we need to teach them transport means carry across? Or is that something that's better for high school history or social studies or something? So I think the jury's a little bit out on kind of like that complex analysis. And to your point, yeah, like you don't always need to go all the way down that road in order to get the benefit that kids need for reading the words.
And I think it's really nuanced depending on the teacher knowledge. Someone just reading, I guess, maybe a script from a manual who doesn't really understand the word structure themselves is going to have not as much success of someone who really understands the linguistic features and maybe can navigate conversations differently or lead students differently. And so that plays a huge role into how students would be successful in morphology in the first place, too.
Totally. Yep. Couldn't agree more.
I'd love to get practical and maybe we could pretend we're fourth grade teachers and say a fourth grade student struggling with a content specific word, something like photosynthesis. Like what kind of processes would you hope would be happening in the brain for a student to tackle reading that word?
So happening in the brain. Okay. So there's what's happening in the brain versus what we do as teachers. But in the brain, okay, so it's this kid who's a struggling reader. So the first thing I'd want them to be doing is seeing the part photo, which would be familiar to them because they've seen that word before. A kid who's a poor reader may not have seen photo enough times or be well tuned enough to that they're finding that as a unit in the word. So that's something that can be a challenge for kids who are poor readers. But even though photo, it's more than one syllable and technically could be photo, but we want kids to be finding things like photo if they're there because those are useful tools that we can have. And then in terms of synthesis, if they happen to know the word synthesis, great. I'm going to guess a fourth grader probably doesn't, definitely a fourth grade reading difficulty who probably doesn't have as much experience practicing reading words anyway. It's one of the things that's challenging for kids who are poor readers is they have reading difficulty, and then you get this kind of Matthew effect they talk about where because you have a hard time, you don't read and you don't learn. And so your ability to read words just kind of declines over time. But let's imagine you're a kid who doesn't know about word synthesis. Then I'd want you to be showing me that you can look at the parts sin, the, and cis and basically pronounce those. So SYN says sin. Right now, how do we know what Y says? Y can say four things, right? It can say I, E, and whatever you want to say. The first sound is Y or whatever. Sometimes people say it's E.
The fight. the water cooler.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can get into that later. But yes, so I would say that I do typically teach kids that the Y can say multiple things. I teach them the different things they can say. So I'd want them to come up with something for that. And if I've taught them that the Y in the middle says "I," then they should say sin. And then "the" and "cis." Now they can look at "the" as "the," or they can look at it as, "the," just like the part, and then they see cis, right? And so they know their patterns that SIS says cis because of vowels in the middle. THE, the E's at the end, says the, and then sin, and I can put together photosynthesis. And then I can tweak it to make it sound better, right? Because, even with the word like THE saying the, when we actually say THE, typically we say the, right? But here it's the. And as we talked about too, you're always going to have to tune that. So what I'm also going to be looking to see is if a kid can tune it. So they don't just say photosynthesis and that's it, because some kids get stuck there, right? And they get stuck either because in this case, they may actually have heard photosynthesis by the time they get to fourth grade because, often kids learn about that in elementary units in science, but they haven't read it. It's going to be hard for them to kind of blend it together. But I'm going to look to see and hear if they can sort of regularize the pronunciation to make it sound like a real word. And, they might say, if they don't know, they might say photosynthesis or something. And for me, if you say that and I know you don't know the word, I'm actually going to be like, good enough. The way we say it is photosynthesis, your turn, photosynthesis, good. And then we're going to move on. But if you say photosynthesis, because you've never figured that out before, and then you've done a great job of that. But if you have heard it before, and I know you've heard it before, I want you to get the link to the reference in your brain. And this gets to, the idea of sort of set for variability, which this whole thing people have been talking about. So really all set for variability is a terrible term because it doesn't make any sense for anybody. So I try not to use it. But basically what it is about like when you sound things out, as we talked about, it's never going to be quite right. Even when you say all the things, it's going to be slightly different when you say the individual syllables versus the word put together. And so you have to do some kind of tweaking or adjusting, right? And so sometimes a term that actually I think makes more sense is called lexical verification, which also sounds complicated. But the idea of lexical verification is lexicon is your dictionary of words, verification is verifying. So it's basically like saying to yourself, is this word in my mental dictionary, right? Whereas set for variability is the same idea, but it's like 9 steps to get to the same thing I just said. So basically lexical verification is about trying to say the word and then try to figure out in your mind, like, what do I know that's like that? And if it's a new word, I'm not going to know, like we talked about with Yosemite. But if I have a mental reference, what I'm trying to do with lexical verification is link that to a known spoken word, right? And that's a good thing for kids to learn to do. And researchers are increasingly finding that the ability to make that transition between a sounded out word that's wrong and the real thing is a really big deal. And kids who can't do that tend to have a lot of challenges. The example I give of that sometimes is this even happens with one syllable words like fan. Kids will sound it out, and they're like, what word is it? And they cannot tell you because it's very hard for them to do that task of doing that mental manipulation, right? But it turns out that ability is really key. So again, with that kid with photosynthesis, I'm looking to see whether or not they can take photosynthesis and turn it into something that sounds like a real word, whether it's the exact pronunciation that I expect depends on their background knowledge. But yeah.
Yeah, that was really helpful. And so essentially, it's like we don't even have to isolate our strategies in a box. Oh, I only can do peeling off, or I only can do ESHALOV. Like sometimes it's a combination of
Totally.
integrating these strategies depending on the word and your background knowledge coming to the word and what will lend to that too.
Yep.
And I appreciate you talking about that lexical verification. I never heard that term before. I'm going to use it now.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's like, because I know you know about set variability. I mean, it's just like no one understands it. It's like, what are you talking about? So just so your listeners know, like set being it basically means like being set for as a learner, your brain being set for variability, meaning basically being prepared for the fact that things are variable and that what you say might not be quite right. That's the idea. If you ask me, even though it sounds a little more technical, lexical verification is a much easier idea. Like I'm trying to find if there's a word that I know in my brain like that. So yeah, so I like that one too, right?
Yeah.
I think it's more more clear at least.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Cross-checking that mental lexicon. And then if you don't have it, then just tell them. Like, we don't have to be afraid to give them that oral language and have them repeat it, have them say the word and add those pronunciations to their brains.
Check on that, Michelle. I think that's really important is getting them to say it because basically you don't know the word if you can't say it, right? And so really a key strategy for teachers to think about is when you are having kids repeat words back to you, if they didn't get it right or if they did, listen carefully, make sure they got every single thing in there because if they're missing any little sounds, it's because they're not hearing them and they literally don't know what the word is. So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. I'd love to end with one more practical note. And this may be your opinion, or this may be backed by research, or this may be even nuanced. But in an upper elementary classroom, what should decoding look like when we're talking about literacy? Should we have advanced decoding with polysyllabic words as part of the literacy block for all students? Should it be at the small group table, reserved for intervention for those who need it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think it should be pretty limited for kids who are sort of typically achieving. So I think teaching them in, say, third grade about syllable rules, ESHALOV, peeling off works, I think is a valuable thing to do. A little bit of that in fourth grade is helpful as well, but a really limited amount. One of the things that researchers have shown is that if we do too much of this stuff with kids who don't need it, it turns out not to be very good for them. And so trying to manage that really, I think it definitely is something for small group. It's critical to be able to have strategies to read the long words. So for kids who are not getting that just from practice and so on, they must have that. People say like, well, quote unquote, the other kids didn't need the same amount of teacher support. Why are we giving it to these kids? Maybe they can benefit from the same thing. Totally untrue. So researchers have shown that if kids are the highest performing, they do the best when they get lots of opportunities to practice reading books and stuff kind of independently or with partners and so on. And the lowest performing kids, even lowest 20 to 30% of kids, they must have the teacher instruction. So for those kids, you do not give them that small group instruction focused on teaching these strategies, they're not going to achieve as much as they should. So that's, I think, a really great thing to remember is that while this instruction should be limited overall for the kids who have some reading difficulty, it doesn't even need to be like identified disabilities, although that's good for those kids too, but they must have that teacher-led instruction. And then in terms of the broader classroom, I think it can be pretty limited. Sometimes people have like kind of like a word study kind of thing where they'll do, different things with words, right? Kind of explore words a little bit. And I think it could be part of that, but I wouldn't spend a ton of time on it. Hard to say exactly how much depending on your kids and whatever, but I would really manage that. The biggest thing that I think that can be helpful for is spelling. So in English, English spelling wise is really rule driven. You can learn to read English without all the rules. Spelling is harder. So during the whole language era, people talk about being good readers, poor spellers. And I'm sure some of your listeners who grew up going to school in the 90s, early 2000s, like they know exactly what you're talking about because they're like, feel like they're really not good spellers and they can read a, blue streak. And the reason is that they didn't get spelling instruction. So spelling instruction is still valuable for getting kids to be good at spelling words because in English, there's no way to know sometimes except to know the rule, right? Do kids need to know that TCH is the spelling of ch after short vowel? For reading, no. But if you want them to spell it correctly, it is kind of helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that's so helpful. And then when we think about utilizing these words, whether for limited whole group or whether for targeted small group, in terms of complex words, like should we have these tightly controlled polysyllabic words? Should they be like driven by the content that you're teaching? You're pulling kind of like vocabulary words. What are your thoughts on that?
You ask the best questions, I gotta say. So the answer is, like all things nuanced. I think for the purposes of decoding instruction, they should be selected for their word properties. So it's not just because they're words that you happen to be reading. You really need to select words in that case for helping them build the patterns and so on. So that's really the thing to do there. And then in terms of that control piece, so for learning to identify patterns, read words on their own, I think that it's helpful to mostly give them words that kind of fit the pattern. But what you're referencing is that researchers have been thinking a lot about the idea that giving kids exposure to words that don't always follow the pattern, like in reading, might be helpful. So some people are talking now about controlled text rather than decodable text. The idea being that we don't always have to lock it down to like every single letter sound has to have been taught in here, right? Many of the things should be, but it might be okay to include some words and patterns in these texts that students have not entirely learned to decode, right? Because that can be actually helpful to them to sort of start to build that muscle of making those adjustments, doing that lexical verification kind of thing on their own. The key is not to make it too difficult, right? And to make sure that you're giving them enough practice with that kind of decoding. But in some of the work that I've done, we did some computer simulations of reading. And one of the things we found in those computer simulations was that if everything was purely decodable, it didn't always produce the best results. That it really did seem to help to have a lot of practice reading. And so that's where I think having this idea of controlled text is a really good one and an emerging idea. And so, your listeners are lucky to have you asking the questions because of me and others, because, you're asking the right questions. Everything you're asking about is something we either know or we're on the cutting edge of. So a couple of years, we'll probably know even more about that. But I'm really glad you highlighted or asked that question because I think we're increasingly realizing fully tightly controlled decodable text might be too much. And it's okay to have a little flexibility, right? Because that will help kids expand their skill, provided you don't go too far and it's lots of stuff that's too hard for them. So thanks for asking about that.
Yeah,
Great
thank
question.
you. Thanks for acknowledging. And it really is like finding that balance of fine tuning, like when do we relinquish some of that decodability? How early can we practice that for variability so students don't suddenly think, oh, wait, I learned the code and now like it's not working for me. Like it's still going to be reliable. We just have to become more flexible with that.
Totally right. Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes will call, I think I mentioned this when I came to New York. I said, sometimes I call it the great con. Like you basically have to lie to children. You have to tell them like, so E says eh. What does it say? Eh. Good. Now, but also EA says sometimes. Now it says E, you say, so also E says E, and it's two E's, it says E. Kind of have to admit over time the complexity of it, right? And the reason we sort of quote lie to kids is we introduce it in a strategic way so that they learn the most frequent things first, the most reliable things first, and we slowly introduce them to this so they don't ever get the impression the system is totally chaos, right? Because researchers will say, there's this researcher, Charles Perfetti, which is the irregularities in the system should not be an excuse, he says, for not teaching the exemplary regularities in the system, because English does have a lot of stuff that works, and we ought to use that and not give kids the idea that, like, you might as well look at the ceiling because the letters aren't going to tell you anything, which is what kids end up doing.
Yeah, definitely. I love the magical word can. It can do this. It also
Yeah.
can do this.
Right.
And then, well, we talked about like having tightly controlled in primary grades. So K2 teachers love a scope and sequence. And then 3-5's like, what do we do? So is there a progression that we can follow as well? Or this is still kind of up in the air?
I think it's up in there. So basically, the principles for me in terms of like, what do I teach kids? It's a matter of frequency and reliability, right? So the main thing is frequency. How often are kids going to encounter a given pattern? And I actually have a list of like 82 patterns that occur more than 100 times in a database I have, words for kids in elementary school. And so that's on my website. And so you can find that list. There's nothing sacrosanct about it. It's not like, the best thing on earth necessarily, but, you really want to be strategic about what you select. I have this other list that has hundreds of patterns on it because I wanted to show people all the patterns, but then apparently some school district, school board in Canada decided to use it to like establish their curriculum. And I was like, oh, this is very bad, because don't teach everything that's possible. Select the things that are most high utility. And so by the time kids get to the upper grades, you're going to be teaching them things that are lower frequency and so on. But you need to make a decision and be thoughtful about this. At what point do we just need to like stop, right? Like we don't need to teach every possible rule. There are a lot of things you could teach we don't have to teach, and that's what we need to manage our expectations around, is sort of design that. So no, do I have an answer for the upper grades? Exactly. I mean, I empathize with the desire to have a scope and sequence. I can't offer an exact one necessarily, but I think the affixes are really important, and having a list of affixes, usually organized by frequency. And the one on the list on my website, they are organized by frequency. You can see which ones are more frequent. And just FYI for your listeners, suffixes are much more common in English than prefixes. So you'll have more suffixes than prefixes on your list. That is appropriate. Introduce them in order of frequency so kids are always getting the most useful stuff first.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And the frequency, transparency, that's all really great things to consider when we're considering our morphemic construction too. And sometimes I'll see lists like the most common bases in Latin, and I'll see something like aqua. And when you actually look at the words, there's like 5 words with aquarium and aquatic, and that
Totally.
not. So like some things you'll just get, you'll get just by experiencing language, and some things deserve some more explicit instruction. And
I think that's a great point. I think that's really great. And, I think one of the things that's really important for listeners to understand, because now that so many people are immersed in the science of reading, which is so great, it gets to this point where they start to worry about anything that doesn't sound like individual letter sound instruction, right? That's all really important. Explicit instruction in phonics has such a long, storied track record of being effective. But we want to make sure to understand that there are ways in which we're going to learn things without it being taught to us in that kind of direct way. That's okay, right? And that's part of learning. That doesn't make us whole language teachers, or we're not going to teach every pattern, right? We're still focused on helping kids understand the letter sound system of the language. But it's also okay to say some things you're going to figure out by reading, and we don't necessarily need to touch. I'm glad you teach that exactly. I'm glad you said that, because that's a big point I think a lot of people are trying to get across. Is we know a lot about the phonics, we need to be teaching that, but let's be thoughtful about the degree to which it is. We're not teaching EA saying A, not that helpful. It was it was 20 words or something like that, right? Including frequent words like they, great, right? So, in EY it says A in they. And so, like you said, it gets more credit than it should because a few words really have that pattern in it. But again, we don't need to learn every single thing. We need to learn a lot of really strategically created things.
Yeah, until we could escape velocity, right?
That's right. You know it. That's right. That's what they say. Escape velocity. You don't need velocity. You don't need that anymore to kind of expand your universe. You can just keep on going.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a wonderful and an insightful conversation, and I'm so grateful for your contributions to the field. And maybe you can share where listeners can connect with you further. We'll be sure to link a lot of your resources on your website in the show notes as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, I would just say, I'm not just saying this to be nice, but your listeners are lucky to have you as a podcaster, because other folks, I've worked with it great too, but you ask really incisive questions. You clearly know the literature and right on the cutting edge of it. So, great job to you, Michelle. And thank you for having me and all of that. So in terms of where you can learn more about me, my website's the easiest place. So I'm even embarrassed to tell you this, but it's devinkearns.com. I just it's so embarrassing. But that's what it is, devinkearns.com. Go to my first name, last name.com. Kearns has an A in it, K-E. Kearns rhymes with learns and is spelled the same way.
There you go.
Which is appropriate for me as a teacher. But yeah, so that's the best place to learn anything. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I've been trying to figure out what's my best platform. So I'm doing LinkedIn and occasionally on Facebook and increasingly on Instagram. So I think just add me on all those things. But right now it's mostly going to be the website and LinkedIn. But stay tuned to see me more on Instagram this year.
Fantastic. We'll link it all up. Well, thank you again so much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Have a great fall semester for folks who are listening at the beginning of the year.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.